Welcome to The Learning Core, a podcast by Telos on the Telos channel. Together, we'll interrogate the core issues of conflict with experts from around the world and uncover the path toward creative action in our communities. My name is Sarah Sturm, and I'm your host. Today, we're continuing our series of conversations centering our practices of listening to understand and holding competing perspectives in tension. Before we can hope to heal our world, we must first learn to see it how it actually is. By listening to understand, we cultivate our curiosity while surfacing the motivations and views that underlie the issues that divide us. Peacemaking recognizes that my story is not the only story, and holding perspectives in tension allows us to engage the views and experiences of others, even and especially when they do not reconcile with our own. These practices unlock our abilities to better identify causes of and solutions to otherwise intractable conflict. For this conversation, I'm joined by Ashlee Eiland. Ashlee is a thought leader, writer, and Bible teacher who exists to join in God's redemptive work on earth. She earned her BA in International Relations from the University of Southern California and her master's in Organizational Leadership from Judson University. She also completed certificate work at both Moody Bible Institute and Fuller Seminary. Ashlee currently serves as the head of school at Living Stones Academy, a Christ-centered, intentionally inclusive, and academically rigorous elementary school in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She formerly served as co-lead pastor at Mars Hill Bible Church in West Michigan, as well as vice president of partnerships for the Colossians Forum, a nonprofit that works to harness the power of disagreement to restore connection. Ashlee's the author of 3 books, Miles and His Many Friends, Humankind, and Say Good, which released this past May. I wanted to invite Ashlee to join this series of conversations on listening, in part to help answer the question that often comes up about what comes after listening to understand. If we're building relationships across lines of difference that are mutually transformational, when can and should we use our voices and speak into the conversation? Ashlee's new book, Say Good, Speaking Across Hot Topics, Complex Relationships, and Tense Situations, invites us to discover the power of stewarding our unique voice through a 4-port discernment process, through passion, accountability, influence, and relationship, to understand the spaces, ways, and times where our words are desperately needed. Whether you identify as Christian or not, I hope this conversation and Ashlee's insights help you find the conviction and confidence to speak up when the time is right in pursuit of mutual flourishing. Ashlee, welcome to the Learning Core podcast. We're so grateful to have you join us today.
Sarah, thanks for having me. It's a joy to be with you.
I want to start by naming the moment we're all collectively in. When you and I are having this conversation, it's the day before the election. When people hear this, it'll be a week after the election. And I think all of us feel a heightened sense of emotion navigating across lines of difference around elections. But at the end of the day, challenging conversations can and should happen not just around election week. And I want to start with a quotation in your introduction. And it's a question you ask your readers that I want to flip back and ask you, which is, when the pressure mounts culturally, politically, relationally, what do we choose to say? What about when the pressure isn't just outside us, but also within us, grating and grinding against our most easily bruised pain points as the most egregious of injustices? This book is you choosing to say something, to put your voice out into the world. And because it's all about knowing when to find your voice, how to use it, how to say good in public spaces, why was this the book that you wanted to put out in this current moment?
It's such a good question. I really think that when I started writing this book, I wasn't anticipating exactly the specific context of 2024, November 2024. When I started writing it, it was actually, much earlier. And so I think I was looking ahead and yet writing in the current moment where I found myself then. And that was 2020, right around when, we were all home and in isolation because COVID had just hit. And so I was really captured by my friends, my personal kind of circle of folks who I trust and who I'm in regular relationship with. When Ahmaud Arbery was killed, and when we started finding out about that headline, we were in this moment, particularly on social media, if some of us might recall, where there was a centering, and I think rightfully so, this recentering of marginalized voices. And so for that time, it was historically marginalized Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices that were being centered. And at the same time, I had friends who were majority white women who were wondering, what do I do with Ahmaud Arbery? What do I do with this personal strife that I feel, this desire that I have inside of me to both speak against racial injustice and speak up in the wake of racial injustice that I'm seeing kind of personified through Ahmaud's story and headlines, while also being honoring of the current cultural moment that we're in and centering voices that have been historically marginalized. So there was this real tension playing out in 2020, and I felt it and I resonated with it so deeply, because for me, I didn't feel the same way that my friends did, but I recognized that visceral reaction of wondering, how do I step into this moment that's both authentically me and also aware of what's happening around me. I have felt that sense of paralysis before in reaction to other headlines, maybe not Ahmaud's, but in other instances. And so I wrote this book, Sarah, for those of us who aren't theologians, for those of us who aren't in academia, who are paid for or looked to in order to have these conversations in a regular column in our favorite news source. But I wrote this for the everyday person, for the person who's listening, who's thinking, I felt that way before, where whether it was my family or with a group of colleagues or just with those who I would call my followership online, where I too felt paralyzed and where I didn't know what to say and what was mine to say or not. And so this book is for the likes of us, those who want to steward their voices well, who have this desire to be thoughtful about the impact that our voices have in the spaces and environments around us, and who long to be brave and courageous in wading through even the riskiest of territories.
Everything you just described resonates with me personally, and I think will resonate for a lot of the folks that come back from our Telos trips, whether to Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, through the U.S. South. Because one of the things we hear, right, is center leadership of the marginalized, listen to voices. All of that's incredibly important. And also, right, we're being pushed to advocate, go and see, come home and share those stories, right? Or sometimes that slogan, silence is violence, right? We're invited, we're asked to use our voices to speak up now that we've learned about injustice or issues of violence that need to be transformed. And that's a tension I think a lot of us sit in. And what I loved about your book is it very practically lays out different exercises we can do to think about, when do I speak up, right? When do I sit back and listen to understand? How do I do the deeper work of knowing when and how I want to harness my voice, and where and when I want to use it to greatest impact and effect? But I want to start with, I think, the metaphor you used of walking on a tightrope, because I think that also really describes what a lot of our trip alumni and our network experiences, right? Is this feeling of trying to balance. How do I listen empathetically? How do I build relationships across lines of difference? How do I do all of these things, feeling these tensions, holding things in tensions, while also trying to move forward or walk forward? So before we dive into some of those specific pillars that you wrote so beautifully about, I'd love to hear you share more about why you think it's important for us to find our center and figure out how to balance before we charge forward.
Yeah, so I love that question because it often sparks a secondary question, which is why I chose the metaphor. And for me, I'm a visual learner, and I really embody what I try and communicate. And so as I was thinking about this tension, I thought about a book I grew up reading called Mirette on the High Wire. And I thought, this is it. That's exactly what this feels like sometimes, where we're trying to strike the correct balance in our pursuit of existing and relating across difference. And what I appreciated about kind of being able to dive into what I learned was called funambulism, or the study of the art of tightrope walking, was that the greatest tightrope artists didn't start crossing the Grand Canyon. And even studying schools where tightrope walking takes place, there's this intense focus on finding one's core and sense of place and sense of balance, and being really humble in the approach about starting from a low distance, from walking a short rope, from learning how to fall. There it is, the assumption that we will fall and that we will make mistakes. So inherent in finding our core is saying we're coming to the proverbial wire with humility. And I think for us, establishing that core is this self-centric examination of who am I uniquely? What are my strengths? And what are the areas that I'm bringing to the table in this pursuit that will require more work and will require a sharpening of sorts? Who am I bringing along with me in this journey to learn and to grow? It requires a sense of community kind of built into it. So when we establish our core, just like we would in, pick an exercise. For me, I'm not like huge into marathon running or anything like that. I'd rather stay home and, lift my hands in my mouth and eating a bowl of ice cream. But if we are establishing our core, there's an intense focus on certain muscles. And that's where we start. And that's why we start here, because in order to do this work well, there has to be this established foundation. And really, for me, in my lens as a Christian with a Christian worldview, I feel like I have to come back to something greater than even the depths of my own knowledge or the confines of my own knowledge or the expanse of it. For me, that's been this reliance on this surrendered posture that is open and trusting of a greater deity. And for me, that deity is Christ. For our listeners, it might be some other deity that they worship, or some may not ascribe to any organized religion at all, and that's okay. So what is it that we fall back on when we are beyond ourselves? When we kind of find ourselves in hot water or in situations that are way above, where we're way in over our heads. To me, coming back to core is a recentering posture that brings us back to this groundedness and space of stability.
I love that you bring in We're Out on the High Wire. I haven't thought about that book in probably 20 years, and I loved it as a child, in part because I think one of the things I loved about the character of that young girl determined to do this was she had her naysayers, but she also had the people who believed in her, who were going to help her live out this goal, right? And this goal, this dream of figuring out how to do this, I think for all of us looks different, but everything you just shared made me think about, telos is a fancy Greek word, but it means that towards which all our energy is focused. And I think as you were sharing, it made me think of our telos, which is mutual flourishing or building the beloved community. And as we bring our own personal cores, right? For you, one that's rooted in your faith. For others, it might be rooted in something else. Thinking about how that intersects with this deep commitment, this telos of mutual flourishing and beloved community, when it gets hard, when we get negative feedback, when we get pushback, when we feel like we say the absolute wrong thing, remembering that we're moving forward in pursuit of this, right? That is the goal. I think that's so important, and being able to direct, to drive why we want to build these skills, why we're harnessing our bravery as well as our humility at the same time, right? To move towards that shared end goal that we believe is true, that we want to see enacted and happen.
Yeah, I love that, Sarah. And like that mutual flourishing, that phrase for me just brought to mind this idea that in this work of learning to disagree and be in relationship across difference and speak in the wake of great risk, and sometimes even while we are fearful. Part of what I'm trying to embody myself and help others say yes to is, yes, their courage, but to not lose ourselves in the process of this work. I think oftentimes we can be so self-giving at times where we are deferring to listening to the opinion of the other that we forget ourselves. This is kind of unlike me to say, but there is this generosity in this work that we are giving of ourselves. But I also just listened to this clip from Mr. Rogers that I shared with our staff at the school where I serve. And it talked about sometimes the greatest enemy being the voice inside our own heads. And so can we give ourselves just as much grace and understanding as we give to the other? Sometimes that's the harder work, is to afford our own lives and our own identities, the kind of perspective and grace that we might offer to someone else whose story we're picking up for the first time. And so for me, it's this reminder that it is this mutuality, and it's not always about the other. That mutuality sometimes has to be redirected toward ourselves in this work. Sometimes I can be my harshest critic, and the compassion that I extend to a friend or even a stranger can be so rare in my own self-dialogue. And so this work truly never ends for that reason, and that we are constantly having to assess, where does that telos need to be directed? Is it toward the other? Is it within myself? And so truly, this is an ever progressing work and journey that we are entering into.
Absolutely. I think that's what I appreciated so much about you laying out these 4 pillars of helping us discern how and when to use our voices. And what I liked about all of them collectively is there's a self-interrogation that's built in. Where am I seeing myself do this well? Where do I want to lean in? And we'll get to this a little bit later, but whose feedback do I want to take? Who do I trust enough to tell me hard truths when I do say the wrong thing at the wrong time? And also not let that shut me down from advocating what I'm passionate about. So I'd love to touch on each of those because I think in their own ways and then also collectively, right, they offer some really important reminders about how, when, why we should show up and not just listen to understand, but coming confidently, rooted in love, but recognizing that we also have something important to say that we want our communities to hear. So I want to start with the first pillar, which is passion. And you alluded to this before, a little bit before, but I think it includes the idea of sacrifice, right? When we advocate, when we use our voices, when we maybe push the boundaries a little bit on what's comfortable for people to hear, when we speak truth in a way that is deeply true for us, but might not be something that other people want to hear or are ready to have a conversation about. There can be risks, there can be pushback and blowback. So I'd love to hear what you have to say around how passion and sacrifice and a willingness to push ourselves go into developing this muscle.
First, the root of the word passion is passio, and we have to really look at this word differently than how we kind of throw it around in our English lexicon, if that's your first language. The root, passio, means suffering. So for those of us who kind of carry a Christian worldview, we'll hear the phrase the passion of the Christ and automatically have this view of Jesus on the cross, and then, understanding his death, burial, resurrection, ascension, kind of in that progression. But what I come back to and what I remind folks with whom I'm in dialogue is that that wasn't an act of sacrifice in and of itself. It was for love. It was suffering in service of love. And so when I redefine passion for folks in the book and in conversation, I really call us to the fact that passion isn't just about a hobby, something you like to do. It's truly a holy grace that you've been given to suffer or endure through an area of brokenness in the world or a subject matter that most people cannot. And so when we look at our passions, you really have to ask, where have I been given this kind of supernatural endurance to weather ups and downs, to weather opposition? And the example I like to use for me is in our family story, our family has been formed through adoption. And so that is a yes that myself and my partner gave in our parenting journey. And for most people who know anything about adoption, you know that, yeah, it's really beautiful, but it's also inherently broken, where there is separation and there is grief and there is loss. That's not for everyone to steward. But for whatever reason, that is a passion that has been placed inside of myself and my husband to kind of walk forward together as a family. And so even though we face grief and sadness and frustration and anger, even in response to broken systems, we have been given this endurance that's beyond us. And so that's how I know it's a true passion area, because it's not done within my own strengths or within the kind of boundaries of my own human limitations. And so for those of us who are really asking questions about our passion areas, sure, we can examine our hobbies and what we like to do, but is there an area of the world or kind of injustice that exists where we say, doesn't matter what kind of opposition I face, I'm showing up to the table. That's how we know our passion is alive and well. And that's how we know we've been uniquely gifted to speak out in a certain area, or at least part of the way we know.
Yeah, I think the question you posed in the book that really struck a chord with me was that question of what injustices make you weep. Because I think, like a lot of people, I care about a lot of different issues. There are so many that could take my time and energy, right? And it's not that I don't care about all of them or that they're not all equally important. But part of why I'm at Telos is because I care so deeply about Israel, Palestine, and our American relationship to the Holy Land, right? That is an injustice. That is a tenuous set of injustices that make me weep. And so I'm using my voice right through Telos at the moment. But that's why I think I'm not being super eloquent, but that's why what you said really resonated, right? Where do we feel like we are so convicted that this is where I'm going to risk relationship or risk pushback and feedback for the sake of using my voice to push? But I think a piece of this that also is so important that you write about in your book is that we have to at the same time discern about places where we feel like we belong enough, that are also places of rest and respite, where we can push, we can advocate, but it's not rooted in exhaustion or anger, right? I'm wondering if you have anything to say around that. How do we discern that piece about passion and also knowing when to use passion in a context where it feeds back into us and isn't rooted in just anger?
Yeah, that's so good. I think when I immediately think of passion, I think about the long game. Whereas, like a hobby or an interest can be seasonal, your passion is usually something that has its origins in who you've always been. And it will have something to do with who you will continue to be into the future. And so there's something that we have to do with passion when we look at kind of the large scope of it. We look at kind of it on a spectrum, and we have to say, with anything that exists beyond a short time period in our lives, what are the rhythms of rest and renewal that kind of accompany something that can be so filled with emotions like anger and with great excitement, like these high highs and these low lows, where oftentimes, and just to be real about it, there's certain times where I look at my passion areas and I can go from this like elation that feels like I'm on cloud nine all the way to a depression where I'm like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. There's a kind of anger that accompanies passion that isn't destructive, that's actually motivating. That's anger in service of a more just world versus anger that's in service of a more destructive world. And so there's this proverb that I love. It's Proverbs 18:22, and it's the Message version. Words kill, words give life. They're either poison or fruit. You choose. And so, as we examine our passion areas, the words that we choose to accompany our passions can either give life or lend themselves to death. And so, for me, there's no such thing as a neutral word. And that's been a really convicting thought for me as of late, that there's no neutral territory in which I swim. And that as I kind of examine these rhythms of rest and renewal, where I engage and then I step back. The times where I step back for me, Sarah, have been times of great self-examination where I'm able to say, has my anger taken me to such a place where I'm now entering into destructive territory? Or am I still fueled by this kind of righteous anger that lends me to love? That becomes the question, but it's only when I retreat and kind of take a pause, put the phone down, so to speak, turn off kind of all these inputs to ask that question and tell myself the truth about the role that anger is currently playing in that long game for me.
I think that's such an important question for us all to self-interrogate. Where is it a deeper anger that's rooted in sorrow for a brokenness, right? A lack of justice and peace that convicts us. And when it is an anger that is a flash in a pan that leads us to speak in haste and say things that we don't necessarily want to say, that we know don't point us back towards justice or reconciliation. I want to draw in the second pillar now, which is accountability, because I think this to me helps me frame how do we cultivate passions that are rooted exactly as you just described. Can you share a little bit about accountability, especially about the role of community living in interdependence and the trust that is necessary to be able to do this work in a way that is courageous, but also gives us that grace that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I love the way that you asked that question. So for most of us, accountability, especially if we've had any proximity to the Western Evangelical Church, can kind of stoke in us these feelings of like punishment, what it means to be held accountable in a punitive way. I actually love to think about accountability as a co-laboring that leads to testimony. And I don't write it exactly that way in the book, but when there are a few things I wish I had written in the book that I just didn't after the fact, as I'm thinking about what I've written. But there's a narrative in the Gospels where Jesus sends the disciples out 2 by 2 to go do the things that Jesus has done, right, in community. And I think about that passage a lot more now than I ever have, because I go, the math could have been different. Jesus could have said, I'm going to send each one of you individually to a different territory or different town or region and kind of cover more ground that way. But it's interesting that Jesus has said, no, I'm going to send you 2 and 2 together. And I think, as I think about that passage more, could have been a couple reasons for that. One, they get to kind of sharpen each other along the journey. So they keep each other true to the task and the goal at hand, right? But second, as they're telling the story on the way back, they now have someone who can give testimony to what actually has happened there. And so for me, accountability is an opportunity to and an invitation to tell the story well. My grandmother, she's passed now, she grew up in Texas, and she kind of worked our family farm for most of her years into her 90s. And she would always say to me, Ashlee, you always need someone in your life who can tell you about yourself. And what she meant by that was you always need someone who can, despite how far you've fallen or how far you strayed from the path, can be trusted enough to tell you, this is who you really are. This is who you are. This is who God has called you to be. This is you at your truest and best self. And that person can speak such a way in your life to call you upward and put you back on the path, even if you feel defeated or feel like you failed. And so accountability really is this opportunity to do life humanly in community together. Not just so that we don't get in trouble, but so that we can tell a better story and so that we can bear witness to the work that each other is doing in the work of justice and reconciliation as we're seeing it along the way. And I think we underestimate the role of encouragement in a lot of these spaces where every so often, there's this meme going around on social media, there's this check on your strong friends. Many of us who are courageous in the work that we're doing need encouragement more regularly than we'd like to admit. And so accountability is also there to encourage us, and courage in French, it's this heart posture. It gives us the heart we need to move ahead in the work that we've been given to do. So I don't want to dip too deeply into relationship yet, because I know that's coming, but accountability, I think, can be reframed for the better and not kind of be held as this punitive idea that we've made it to be.
Yeah, I love all of that. And I think one of the things that really resonates with what you just said is it's trusting, without jumping to relationship, it's trusting a few key relationships to tell us hard truths, especially about where we maybe fall short, but also to trust that they are telling us the truth when they tell us that we've done something right or give us that courage. And sometimes, I am one of my own harshest critics. I think for people who are passionate and motivated, it's not always easy to believe other people when they tell you you've done something well, right? Or that your passion passion is directed in a good direction, or that it's worth continuing to try and push and speak and find and use your voice. So developing those relationships that you can trust enough to tell you where you do go astray, or offer you a nice little redirection or check or critical question to examine, trusting that they offer both, right? That genuine encouraging feedback and the necessary self-interrogation. I think it's so important that those are intertwined in relationships and hold us accountable, not just in a, like you said, negative, punitive way, but to our own deeper values and the kind of life we'd like to live out. So that, oh, so resonant and important. And I like how we're reclaiming the idea that accountability doesn't just have to be something that's negative.
No, it can also, like, one other thought that I have around that is, for any of us who are kind of pulling from different areas in our life where we're involved in so much, accountability can also help us tailor our yeses to be the best yeses we can give. So oftentimes, my friends, it's not even about the work that I'm doing. One of the jokes with my friends is they'll text me, "Why DTM, Ashlee? Like, you're doing too much." And that accountability helps me kind of examine and look at even my schedule and saying, am I actually giving my time to the things I am the most passionate about and where I could be the most effective in my leadership and advocacy? And so accountability isn't just about ourselves and our egos. Sometimes it's about tailoring and chiseling away at the excess so that we can come alive in the yeses that we give around our time and our energy. And so I think accountability is beautiful. I can't imagine doing life without it. And yet I sometimes think it does get a bad rep for only being about these really harsh and defining lines of what we can and can't do. And I think it's so much more than that.
Mm. That segues really nicely into the third pillar of influence as well. That question of where can I give an enthusiastic yes and dedicate my time and attention, intentionally use my voice. What really resonated with me about the idea of influence is that we all have a place where our voice holds weight. And that place probably is not online. It's probably rooted in real, tangible, physical, embodied community. And that is where we should work to determine when we can enthusiastically say yes, to invest our time and energy, or be brave and use our voice and speak sometimes hard truths to people who, might not already agree with us. So I'd love to hear you share a little more about how that plays into this, right? How do we identify where we have influence, where we can and should be directed in that time and energy that for all of us is so limited?
Yeah, I would say that instead of seeing influence it as how many followers one has on social media or how many likes or retweets or reposts something receives, I like to think of true influence as anywhere you currently are, because you're there for a reason. And so when I think about kind of the spaces where I am on a regular basis right now, that place is my family and in my own home, my neighborhood association, the school where I serve and where my kids attend. I think of my friendship groups, right? So oftentimes we can get so kind of macro minded about influence as, oh, it has to make a huge splash. It has to be seen by the masses in order for it to be effective. Oftentimes, the most meaningful change that we can see in our immediate spheres of influence happen because no one else is there. It's because we've shown up in that intimate space, in the place that's not recorded, right? That's not seen by the masses. And we're having the hard conversation that no one else will have. We're having the crucial conversation that includes this nuance and context based on who a person is, because we know them better than other people might know them. So I feel like, social media has done so many beautiful things. I mean, look at a podcast like this one where people get to learn and grow deeper in their own journeys. I think one of the drawbacks of social media has been we have forgotten the power of the true influence that we already have. And so we're in the month of November. For those of us who are in the US and who are celebrating American Thanksgiving, that might be the most important table that you show up to this year, because there's going to be a relative that you only see every so often, because you might be surrounded with people who kind of grind your gears. And now is like the true test of everything that you've kind of been learning about yourself and how to have hard conversations. And so, I don't think that online discourse is at a loss. I think it is important, but truly, if everyone were to take stock of where are the places I am regularly, and have I maximized my understanding of my influence at those tables in a way that compels me to show up all the more intentionally. Depending on who I'm talking to, I have different strategies for how folks can kind of relocate their sense of influence. But really, my hope is that people are empowered. I think that's the word I want to use, re-empowered to show up and see those spaces where they are as places that are unique to them. That unique mix of spaces where one might exist is not the same for every person. We are stewarding. I love that word of stewardship. We are stewarding space and place in really crucial ways. And I want us to kind of show up and be mindful of how powerful that could be.
There's two things I want to pick up on in there. One is how this, I think, really complements our practices of listening to understand and holding perspectives in tension, because that's something that we invite people into, is to practice listening to understand before seeking to be understood. And part of why I was really excited to have you as a guest in this podcast series on listening is that's not where it ends, right? Through the practice of deep listening, inviting people to share their stories, their experiences, their beliefs, we cultivate trust and a deeper openness to them in turn hearing us. It's not that we're doing that just strategically, right? This isn't just an instrument to get them to listen to us in the long run, but through that relationship, through that transformative listening, we open up space for us to be able to share and exert that influence. And I think this is another word where sometimes people hear it as a bad thing, right? Like, well, you have influence over other people. Careful, like that could devolve into something bad. But to me, when I was thinking about this, I think at its best, this is also rooted in love and trust. We have influence over people, or we have influence on how people see something because they love us and trust us enough to take seriously what we do share when we share. So that's my invitation to listeners, is to think about how those other practices we talk about dovetail then into how we can advocate, right? Advocate for mutual flourishing, transforming injustice, speaking powerfully in moments where we need to, not at the cost of listening to understand, but as a complement to it.
Yeah. I think the other power in the practices that you just mentioned and examining influence is that when we truly enter into another's story and listen to understand, we become better storytellers. And sometimes that story that we tell is to our own fears. I think oftentimes the most powerful thing that happens when I'm truly listening to understand and I become captivated by the journey of another person is that my fears kind of take a back seat. Whatever I was showing up at the table with in the way of opposition or hesitation or caution, they usually soften the longer I listen. And they might transform into something different, right? It's not always agreement. And I don't think that should always be our final stop on that train. But what come to find is I'm more in awe of the humanity and the diversity of humanity, the longer I'm able to sit in the tension of holding someone else's perspective alongside my own. And so those spaces of influence give us that opportunity to become better storytellers, not just with each other, but sometimes to ourselves. And in that regard, we are not just kind of reclaiming space, where we are reclaiming the place that fear once had and replacing it with true shalom. So even the peace within ourselves gets transformed, right? The more we learn to ask better questions and listen in those spaces of influence that we occupy.
So, so true. And that brings back to the other piece I wanted to tie in, which was authenticity, which I think connects again to choosing to be in person with people, to invest in in-person community versus hiding behind a screen or just investing in an online presence. And I want to read a quotation from your book about authenticity because I think this is so important. Authenticity is about discerning the intersection of what's real and true, both in what we're speaking into and in what we're speaking out of, for the health and wholeness of the entire body. And I think that to me encapsulates that invitation that you just offered us, right? That when we're thinking about our influence, when we're building these relationships, when we're listening and speaking, it is helping other people share authentically, right? Get to what really matters for them, what it's rooted in for them, not just the talking points around policy, but it does that for ourselves as well. It helps us develop an authentic voice that is nuanced, that is flawed, that is not always going to say the right thing, but is again rooted in that commitment to mutual flourishing for the health and wholeness of the entire community.
Yeah, when I think of authenticity, I think of, I think it's a passage in Matthew 12 where Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so whatever your heart is full of, from that place, you will speak. You know, it's an invitation to both examine what is truly in our hearts. And I write a little bit about, it may not be in this section, but our motivations for why we want to show up and speak anyway. And oftentimes the path to true authenticity in learning how to listen and speak courageously and across really risky divides is first understanding our heart condition. Am I speaking from a place of fear? Am I speaking from a place of self-protection, wanting to be right because there's something tied to my identity that has to be right, or else I don't know who I am? So questions like that, trust me, Sarah, can be very scary to ask, but they are so important in understanding who we really are, not just at our best, but also at our worst. And when we are truly understanding the humanity of another, we can come to the table again with that humility of understanding our own. And that's the place, that's the intersection at which true authenticity is birthed. It's not this posturing, it's not this need to be presenting as having things all together or knowing all the answers to the test or having the right opinion even. Oftentimes it's saying, here's my humanity and my brokenness meeting your own. And how do we make it through together? But oftentimes, first, that requires such an intentional look at our own heart conditions. And oftentimes, that's a scarier thing than even trying to show up to someone else's opposing thought or worldview. So I would just say to our listeners, be so kind to yourselves, because that can oftentimes in that authenticity place be the hardest part, is facing ourselves and coming face to face, not with the other, but with our own hearts.
Yeah, that was another question that you posed that I think for me is such an important piece of self-interrogation, which is, when are fear or perfection speaking instead of wisdom and care? And I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves when we're, maybe self-critical or not necessarily rooted in the kind of anger that's rooted in love, but is anger rooted in, opposition or defiance or any of those other kind of flash in the pan emotions. How do we exercise wisdom and care for ourselves when it comes to trusting, right, our own intuition around, I don't want to speak now, or I should speak now? When is discomfort something we should push through? And when is discomfort a signal that we can take some time, right, to self-reflect, to self-interrogate, to make sure that we do feel like we are really rooted in the kind of love and truth and righteous anger, not self-righteous, but righteous anger that enables us to carry this on. And I think we've talked about relationship throughout. It's your fourth pillar, but it's in some ways just at the root of all of these. So I'd love to turn to that now, right? In what ways, kind of 10,000 feet, and very specifically, does relationship really enable all of these other pieces to fall into place?
Yeah, relationship keeps us grounded in humanity and keeps each other's belovedness intact. I think at the heart of this, what we have to understand is we're not battling ideas and opinions. Across from the keyboard or across from the coffee table is another human being. And again, this oftentimes comes back to what we truly believe at our core. So for me, and we've already talked about the faith perspective. For me, I believe that every single human being is made in the imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God, which means there's inherent goodness somewhere, even if it's so hard to name or to see, given what someone has done. And so coming back to relationship, embodied relationship, is so important in how we relate to one another. I think there's a chapter in that section on names and examining the names that we've been called, since our childhood, and how those names have impacted how we move and operate in the world, even today as adults and leaders. If I were to take stock of how one name has impacted me for the better or for the more hurtful, I can see the power in it. I can see the power in the tongue. so for me, even in the most day-to-day situations, I believe there's a chapter in there about our relationship with our pharmacist, Helen. I teach my kids to, whenever possible, use someone's real name, to not be defined even by what they do or the role they are playing in your life that day. So they're not the cashier. They're not the server at a restaurant. They're not the host of a meeting. They are Helen. I'm thinking about our grocery store. There's a guy named Tom that, just every time I see him, I say his name and it's almost like he lights up because he's not expecting it. There are practices that we can institute in our daily lives to help orient ourselves to everyday dignity giving and humanity protecting. And that, to me, is what relationship is about. It regrounds our ideas and our passions and our influence and our accountability into something real, into the place where I feel like we were created in for the first place. We were created for mutual flourishing. We were created for interdependence, which means we were created for one another. If we don't have relationship, then we've lost our way. And so that's the way I chose to end the book, because I want us to really examine the roles that relationships play in our advocacy work, in our allyship, and showing up for one another.
I love that. And one of the things that brought up for me too with the names is this question of legacy that you raise in that final section too. What do we want our legacy to be? And it made me think of something else that I'm not sure where to attribute it to right now, but this idea that people won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is an invitation for all of us to think about as we build these relationships, as we call people by their first names, as we see them as fully complex, nuanced humans who might disagree with us on some things, but also at the end of the day, right, want to flourish, have similar fears, hopes, dreams, concerns, is that question of, even when I speak, right, from love, from frustration, from passion, am I doing it in a way that is inviting people into greater understanding, greater flourishing, or am I doing it in a way that is othering? One of the pieces that a mentor gave me one time that I really appreciated was, we need people to speak truth to power, but not everybody in your life is that power, right? There are times and places where we need prophetic voices. But for so many of us, as we identify where we have influence, it's not that we don't need that prophetic voice, but that energy might not be what's landing and what's heard by our friends, our neighbors, our church communities. So thinking about, how are we speaking in truth? How are we saying good? How are we living out our values? And how are we doing it in a way that's invitational? That's going to leave people remembering that we challenged them. We didn't shy away from these hard conversations or saying what needed to be said, but we did it in a way that also didn't otherize, that didn't alienate, that didn't leave them feeling like there was no room for them to grow alongside us as we grow. So that's where I wanted to land this. It's just that invitation as we all develop our own voices, thinking about how we choose to speak and how that makes people feel, not because feelings are more important than, right, advocating for peace, for justice, for transformation, but because at the end of the day, right, all of us care about that sense of belonging and community. And if we're truly serious about building the beloved community, there has to be room for everybody, even if it feels like, maybe we don't want them at our table. We have to figure out a way to make it invitational enough for them to come back alongside us. So that's me off my soapbox. But Ashlee, my encouragement to everyone listening is that they read this book. There are so many helpful discernment exercises, right, alongside the wonderful stories you tell. But I wanted to give you the final word on, what would you like to leave our listeners with? Is there a call to action, something you'd like them to leave thinking about? Where would you like to land everybody who's spent the past hour with us today?
Yeah, I'd say, my first book before Say Good was on kindness. And in many ways, I call people back to that now, especially in kind of this aftermath of the US presidential election, is that don't forget not just what you say, but how you say it. The how matters just as much as the what. And so as you speak to yourself, be kind. As you speak to the stranger, be kind. As you speak to your opponent, be kind, because you are fostering what you choose to offer the world around you. And so may we find ourselves, it's Ephesians 4:32, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. May we all enter this work with tender hearts.
Amen. Well, Ashlee, thank you so much for coming on the Learning Core podcast, for giving us wonderful food for thought and encouragement. To our listeners, until next time, take care. We'll see you later.